Gregory, would you like to say a few more words about yourself and then start leading us in your mindset or your vision of the future Middle East as you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, thanks for having me. Hopefully, I can provide some interesting perspective. In terms of the conversation, feel free to steer it whichever way is helpful. Interrupt me, questions. If something I'm saying is less relevant or more relevant, I have no ego about it. So happy to try to be as helpful as possible. Maybe I'll start a little bit with my background and then how I wound up in the Middle East, and how that informs kind of my thoughts about the region. So, as Tom mentioned, my mother is Jewish, so obviously makes me Jewish. But my father is from India originally. He's Hindu. In Hinduism, oddly enough, it's the father's bloodline. So technically, I'm both Hindu and Jewish. People have called me a Hindu before, and so I always had kind of connections with both. I spent my professional career first working on Wall Street doing kind of transaction advisory type work, advising companies on buying and selling other companies. And then at a hedge fund where we were what's called a macro, global macro type hedge fund. So thinking about regions and countries and asset classes anywhere in the world and trying to identify opportunities where one may be undervalued or overvalued. So when COVID happened, I took a step back and started thinking about, kind of using that lens of analysis about the world where I had interest in potentially moving my human capital, right? As an investor, people always think about financial capital, but obviously, as a person, you have human capital. You can choose to work in any country or city or in any field or in any kind of environment. And one of the things that became increasingly obvious to me at the hedge fund was a lot of growth around the world is driven by the supply and demand of capital. So if you look at a place like the Emirates, for the last 30, 40 years, the Emirates, the Saudi Gulf, have taken a lot of money out of the ground from oil and natural gas. And they've had this supply of capital, which then has been invested all over the world. It's helped, grow the U.S. stock market. It's helped grow private markets in the U.S. and in Europe, etc. But what you were starting to see for the first time, at least in a meaningful way, was, as Tom mentioned, this kind of, call it a square, call it a triangle, where you had between India, the U.S., Israel, and the Gulf. For this point, I'll just say the UAE as representative of the broader Gulf, an opportunity for kind of capital formation and more of a circular capital movement. And why was this happening? So first off, obviously, the Abraham Accords were signed, normalizing relationship between Israel and a number of countries. Obviously, the UAE is the strongest economically of the counterparties at the moment. In India, you have an incredibly fast and upwardly mobile middle class, depending on how you define it. Some people say the middle class in India is over 400 million people. So that's greater than the entire population of the United States. And so, if you take kind of the fact that the UAE still had all of this oil wealth, it now had the partnership with Israel to potentially access technology and advancements, and then this massive consumer market within India. You start to see the potentials for a shift in global capital flows. And shortly after I went to Israel, I was kind of validated in that with something which actually happened at the highest levels of government, but not that many people have commented on, which was the formation of what they called I2U2. So I2U2 was Israel, India were the two I's, the two U's were United States and the United Arab Emirates, and it was actually signed at the highest levels of government. So Joe Biden signed it for the U.S. I think it was Benny Gantz for Israel, and then it was Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan in the UAE and Modi in India. And the idea was to create an economic partnership initially focused on agricultural security. So, for example, in the UAE, they import something like 97% of their food, but to use that as a leverage point to kind of increase collaboration and economic cooperation amongst those nations. So what wound up happening was I said, okay, this is a very interesting region, an interesting time, and I wanted to try to figure out a way to potentially take advantage of it. So first was in Israel. As I'm sure most of the people on here know, Israel is incredibly tech focused. I think one of the big leaps, and you are starting to see it with something like Bill Ackman buying 25% of the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, is to take Tel Aviv and when I was there, I would equate it very much to a San Francisco. But I think it really has the potential to become almost more of a New York, where it's not just tech, but it's also traditional finance, investments out of there. And we can touch on that separately because that's a little bit of a tangent. But for me, coming from a more traditional finance and private investment background, I wound up in the UAE in Abu Dhabi working for Mubadala. So Mubadala is one of the major sovereign wealth funds that are located in the UAE. They've taken their oil and gas revenue and created these various investment firms that have slightly different but somewhat overlapping goals. Many people are familiar with ADIA, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. That's the largest. They have about 700 billion of assets. Mubadala had about 300 billion, and then there's a few others which are in the 100 to 200 billion dollar range. And what was interesting at the time was Mubadala was and still is starting to recognize somewhat similar to what I had mentioned, which was, we've been taking money out of the ground and investing it all over the world. Why not invest more of it domestically, help build our economy? And then we kind of get a double benefit, right? We get returns, but we also get this growing and more vibrant economy. So I was part of a team which I would kind of call more of a policy/investment group, where I was doing the same type of analysis that I did when I was at the hedge fund in terms of thinking about global economies. But rather than analyzing which one was better or worse, I was saying, okay, these are some of the improvements or initiatives that can be undertaken in order to try to grow the economy domestically. And again, as you can imagine, I'm trying to give you the high level and we can dive down wherever is useful. But each of these obviously could be their own conversations. There was a lot of interesting successes, challenges, which we can discuss. And then ultimately was approached by the hedge fund guys I used to work for about setting up a fund in New York. So came back to the city. So I'll pause there with kind of a high level, and then, like I said, Tom or whomever, we can take the conversation however you wish.
Sure. So first topic that I want to ask you to elaborate on, I think that to many Israelis, when you speak about the Israeli-American alliance, it kind of makes sense. When you speak about the Israeli-American Emirati alliance, that can also make sense, but let's say to less people, okay?
India, you mean? You're saying India, not Iraqi, India.
No, Emirati.
Oh, Emirati, excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, Emirati. Understood.
But when you add in the Indian part, then most Israelis are starting to be confused because India, that is not because of any hostility to India, but India doesn't seem to be related to this conversation looking from Israeli perspective. Can you elaborate how do you see the linkage and the future role of India in this part of the world in the Middle East?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's an interesting point because I think a lot of it does have to do with perspective. So obviously everything I say is coming from my perspective, so take that for what it's worth. But I would have felt somewhat differently insofar as that I would think the India fit is somewhat more natural than the Emirati fit. And I'll explain why. So first off, if you look at the history of the two nations, they're both very, very similar, right? I mean, India was essentially occupied by Britain. Israel was kind of under their protectorate. There was the issue between India and Pakistan, which was kind of the splitting of a Muslim and non-Muslim population, which still has some reverberations today. They both got independence within 1 year of each other. And so, growing up, at least, the irony of all of this was my father, who was the Indian, actually spent quite a bit of time in Israel, doing work with a number of Israeli telecom companies. And so, he was always very much, I don't know if in awe is the word, but very impressed with kind of Israelis, their work ethic, their attitude, and saw a lot of similarities just between the culture and the mindset in Israel than he did in India. I think the thing about India more broadly is India is such a massive economy and there's so many people, right? There's 1.4 billion people that it really is incredibly insulated. So even when you see the issues in modern day with India and the tariffs with Trump, they don't get affected as much because they have a lot of manufacturing domestically, they have a cheap labor force domestically, but they also have a huge consumer economy domestically. So I don't necessarily know if it's not a quote unquote natural fit, but part of the reason why it might be less on the top of people's minds is because India in general has done a pretty good job of maintaining a very insular economy. And now what's happening is as the population is growing, as there's the same issues that is happening in the Gulf with, food security issues, technology, obviously agricultural technology, of which Israel is kind of best in class, they're becoming more interested in understanding how they can leverage international technology in order to feed their domestic market. Now, I don't think I think the way to think about these pieces is slightly different, right? The UAE is, and remember, it's all about supply and demand and what you have and what you need. The UAE has a lot of capital, right? And they have the ability and the need to invest that capital, whether it's around the world or domestically. What they want to do domestically is they want to build up the country from kind of a regional center into, as you've seen, destinations, et cetera. We can talk about that. India is a little bit different because they don't have as much of the kind of quote unquote government capital that the UAE has. It's obviously all private, so that makes it a little bit harder to deal with than when you're dealing with just one centralized kind of entity, and a lot of the demand is more local. So my sense for the future of that relationship is more technology coming from Israel and going into India as compared to potentially something like in the Gulf where you might see more Gulf presence within Israel. And so that also might be part of the reason why it might be less top of mind. Again, growing up for me, it was always top of mind because I came from that background, but I understand why it might not be as natural of a fit. But I think if you look historically at the two nations, India and Israel, there are a lot of synergies. There's a lot of overlap. And look, they're both English-speaking countries for the most part. And so ultimately, the opportunity for something to evolve there, I think is quite powerful.
So I want to continue a bit with this line, if you don't mind. I think that most Israelis think about India as an ally, but a very remote ally who doesn't interfere in the Middle Eastern affairs, not as a superpower, though even that it kind of is a superpower. And on the other hand, first of all, and I'm describing things as they are from an Israeli perspective. First of all, we started hearing, I think it was 2 years ago, very obscure ideas about the transportation passage from the corridor, so-called,
Yeah.
from India. I think that most Israelis didn't even understood what is this discussion about, because it seems that you can sail from India to Israel and it's supposed to be okay. It was not explained to the Israeli public to the extent of what is really planned, okay? And the other thing is that I think most Israelis were not aware of it, but in the last year or so, around the missile crisis with Iran, we had, I think, an unusual event of Indian warships sailing in the Mediterranean as some sort of message, or maybe not a message. But if you will will help us connect the dots, do you think that India will emerge as a player that will be more involved in the Middle East directly, maybe even militarily, or in terms of the same thing, the same patterns that we see from China, but maybe on the other side? Or is it only about transportation routes, and how will those transportation routes be handled, and how will it affect all the sides involved?
Yeah, yeah. Look, I mean, I would say my perspective, and again, I'm sure there are other people who are, 100% India experts. So, please take everything I say again with a grain of salt. But, you know, when you look at India, especially today, India is not the type of nation who wants to pick sides, right? And that's kind of the reason that President Modi is having issues with President Trump, because, they still want to buy Russian oil. They have this kind of strange relationship with China, which is sometimes kind of positive, sometimes it's negative. So in terms of direct involvement in the Middle East, I personally wouldn't see that being very likely in the foreseeable future, because it's just not the modus operandi of India, of the Indian people. I think realistically, the only places where they really have kind of any significant military issues are obviously on the border with Pakistan, and there's been some flare-ups in the border with China. I do think that to the extent that they are ever able to develop this kind of rail network, which has been alternatively proposed there, there's been discussions about something from the UAE through Saudi into India, into Israel, excuse me. It does give them a faster route to Europe. Obviously you can sail through and go through the Suez Canal, but it's just quicker and more efficient to do so over land. Obviously, Iran is in the way, which is kind of a big issue. But to the extent that you can ship into the UAE and then from there build the pipelines or there build the railroad network, which seems to be the place that a lot of people are talking about. And you have to understand there's a large, I don't want to say relationship, but India has a very big presence within the Gulf. One, because a number of people who live there are Indian, just because they're laborers. Two, going back, especially to a place like Oman, there was a huge amount of Indian traders who settled in Oman. And so even now, if you go to Oman, the food is very reminiscent of Indian food. So the idea of shipping from India into one of those ports and then having a rail network to get to Israel or then all the way into the Mediterranean creates a much more expedited shipping route and alleviates some of the risks of having to go through, either the Suez Canal or past Yemen, etc. In terms of the military presence in the Mediterranean, frankly, I'm not 100% sure if there's any broader implications there. Look, India has had regional flare-ups with Pakistan. Most recently, they were actually shooting at each other within the last few months, and obviously those are two nuclear powers. So every time that happens, there's a lot of nervousness around it. But I don't see them having any kind of broader imperial ambitions. I think that they're very much for lack of a better word, kind of mercantilist. They want to make sure that they can expand their economy, have the opportunity to get cheap inputs, even if that means it's Russian oil, and then have the ability to export out where they can.
Okay, so we are in the Trump era, and what we can call the era of business peace, maybe, or peace deals, and obviously both sides, the Israeli side and the Arab side. I'm putting the Indian side in his side for a second. Obviously, both of them are very focused on the Americans as the superpower and the natural mediator. First of all, I would like to ask you, what do you think that we can expect from the remaining 3.5 years of the Trump second term to the Middle East? What kind of things do you think we will see in terms of business cooperation, in terms of the plans that usually, when it comes to the Trump administration, usually come up with combination of financial, economical, and political steps. And afterwards, I will also invite our guests to start asking questions. If you want to, you can write questions on the chat, and I will read it. If you want to, you can raise your hands and ask for yourself. But let's start with this question.
So, look, I think the way to think about the Trump presidency, and I was just having this conversation with a colleague, is it's very transactional. And I'm trying to be very careful not to say whether I agree or disagree or whether I think it's a good or a bad thing. I'm just trying to say the facts as I personally see them. And so I think the idea of any kind of moral backing or sacrifice for a greater cause is something that not just Trump himself, but I do think a large portion of his base has kind of turned away from, right? In the early 2000s, a large portion of the Republican base was fed this idea that, we should go into Afghanistan, we should go into Iraq for some sort of a greater good. And ultimately, given the fact that it didn't really do anything great for the US, I think people have become burned by that. So I think the broader approach to foreign policy writ large of the Trump administration is incredibly transactional. And I think he looks at everything as fungible. So, in the past, people might have disagreements about economics, but they could agree on human rights, or they might have disagreements on trade, but they could agree on systems of government. I think he's willing to trade one thing for another and use leverage wherever he can. And you see that a lot of times with something like with China. On the one hand, everyone was told that getting our chips was a huge national security risk. But then ultimately, when they had another issue around rare earth metals, we were able to negotiate that. So in many ways, you could argue he was negotiating the national security away. But like I said, I think everything is just peace in one big negotiation, and he doesn't really look at them separately. So I think as it relates to the Middle East, I think in that world, and this is now a little bit more of my opinion, naturally the Gulf states are well positioned because they're kind of unilateral, autocratic type places that can make deals or appease the kinds of thing that Trump wants, right? You saw Qatar giving him an airplane, you see Saudi making all of these big announcements, etc. I think within Israel, which obviously the relationship was almost opposite, right? I mean, part of the reason the U.S. has such a strong relationship with Israel is because it's a country that shares our values, it's democracy, etc. But in a world where that moral piece is not really highly valued, I think it becomes a little bit less influential. And I think I'm going a little bit off field here, and feel free to pull me back in. But I do think from an Israeli perspective, as it relates to American politics, there is a risk for Israel within the United States that unfortunately Israel has become associated with a single party, right? The Democratic Party within the United States is not really pro-Israel, and it has nothing to do with whether they're Jewish or not. It's more kind of a vote on Netanyahu. And I think as the U.S. Republican base becomes more isolationist or less influence of Israel, there is a risk that Israel is kind of left out in the cold. And so I think that getting back to the initial topic of the discussion, the idea of diversifying the partnerships from Israel's perspective is incredibly important, right? I mean, essentially since the 73 war, Israel has relied on the U.S. for support, for arms, and I'm not saying it's not a two-way street, but, has been very heavily reliant. I think it would be incumbent upon Israel to try to diversify those such that if things take a turn in America where there is broad support for maybe not fully abandoning Israel, but scaling back that relationship, it's something that can be handled. So that's kind of the way I would think about the Trump presidency and the broader U.S. Political situation.
Okay, you analyze a lot of information, economical information, and not only economical. And basically, as part of what you do, you predict patterns and you see obscurities in the data. What do you see? I mean, especially, I remember that you told me something very interesting about compatibility between Israel and Lebanon, if you can elaborate on that. But I suggest you even fly higher and tell us what do you see in the future from your perspective or analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, that could be anything, but I'll focus on the Middle East for the time being, and we can expand from there.
Yes.
Look, I spent a few years in the Gulf. My wife is actually Lebanese, so I have some time and experience spent there. So I can speak relatively cogently to that region first. I think in terms of where Israel would find the most natural fit for partners, I do think it's the Levant, right? Obviously there's a lot of issues with Syria now, but the Lebanese people in general, look, it's very hard to generalize about Lebanon because you have the kind of Maronite Christian minority and you have the Sunni and Shia population, which is generally a little bit more antagonistic towards Israel. But my sense intuitively is if you look around the entire Arab-speaking world, right? So the Gulf, the Levant, and North Africa. The Levant is the place where you have the kind of closest and the most similarities in terms of work ethic, perspective, business acumen, etc. So it really is a shame there that Hezbollah has become so powerful and has, even just recently they made the vote that Hezbollah is forced to surrender their arms, and Hezbollah pretty much just said, no, we're not going to surrender our arms. So, I think from an Israeli perspective, that would be the most natural fit, but it's somewhat untenable at the moment. That takes you back to the Gulf. the thing about the Gulf is that, you know, the good and the bad thing of this kind of autocratic society is that ultimately the government cares most about staying in power, and whether that means growing the GDP, not growing the GDP, etc. You know, everything is looked at through a very political lens. So it does become very hard. You know, even if you had an idea that could create, you know, $1 trillion of GDP or some ridiculous amount of money, it still has to go through the government channels, not in a way that, you know, if you show up in New York City or in Tel Aviv with a great idea that you can just get to work and start executing on it. So, you know, I think from Israel's perspective, you know, if you look at the Abraham Accords, and I want to be somewhat careful here because I obviously think that they were a great achievement. I think they were a great stepping stone. And, you know, there's nothing bad about normalizing relationships with your neighbors. But if you look at kind of the major counterparties to the agreement and just call it, you know, the Gulf, call it the US and call it Israel, you know, I think the US at the time, it was Trump and Kushner who wanted to get a deal, and they did that. I think the Gulf got access to a lot of Israeli technology. There's a lot of Israelis that are traveling to Dubai. You know, I think Israel, to an extent, was the least benefited from the arrangement. You know, the security threat was never from that part of the world, as we see now. It was obviously Iran and Iran's influence. I think that ultimately the investment dollars from the UAE and from those regions into Israel has been very heavily focused on the kind of military and intelligence technologies, which are at the higher level. I think it's still been very challenging for the average Israeli entrepreneur to, you know, get capital from the Gulf. And there really hasn't been as much of a tourist inflow coming from the Gulf into Israel as there has been from Israel into the Gulf. So, you know, I think it's to say, to the extent that normalizing with the Gulf makes it easier to normalize with Lebanon, with Syria, and obviously Saudi is the big one there, and Saudi has a big influence over the internal politics of Lebanon and always has. You know, I think that's where you start to see a lot of potential, more of the business relationships, just because the cultures and the economies and the people are a lot more similar. And at the end of the day, I mean, you know, as you guys know better than I do, I mean, it's an incredibly vast, diverse region, different people who want to have different goals, different initiatives, different objectives. So, you know, from my perspective, you know, I think what I would like to see out of the region moving forward is not just for Israel to figure out a way to kind of diversify the people upon with whom it works beyond just the United States, but as it relates specifically to the Abraham Accords, you know, to the extent that things pick up after the war hopefully ends, you know, hopefully soon, is some way to get more involvement from a place like the UAE into Israel in a little bit more of an active way, because my sense is it has been a little bit of a one-way street. So again, like I said, I mean, I could speak about this in a bunch of different directions. I don't know if that's exactly what you had in mind, but I'll pause there.
So, first of all, if I understand part of what you're saying, basically, what you're saying is that if you look at at Lebanon specifically, at the Lebanese economy, and the Lebanese workforce, etc., it makes sense to you that this is like the best potential ally for Israel in the neighborhood, in terms of economical cooperation, etc. Do I understand correctly?
I would say if you just look at the Lebanese people and their culture, I would say it's very, very similar. If you walk around Beirut, it feels a lot like Tel Aviv, right? You have the same thing where you have very religious, you have very secular, you have an older society that mixed with kind of a more modern society. Obviously, you have a coastline, and you have a very entrepreneurial group of people. And if you just look around the world, right, you have Jews in the diaspora who have done incredibly well for themselves, and you have Lebanese in the diaspora who have done incredibly well for themselves. I think that ultimately the issue is that while those people are the most similar, given the political situation in Lebanon, that makes it incredibly hard to ever get to a point where you're normalizing. But when I speak to people within Lebanon, you know, my perspective is that again, a lot of these people are more in the Maronite Christian community than either the Sunni or the Shia communities. But my sense is, you know, one, they have no issues with Israel. They're very religious people. They would love to be able to visit Jerusalem. And it doesn't really make sense to them that a place, you know, there used to be a train from Jerusalem to Beirut, you know, that it's impossible for them to go to. So I think from a interpersonal perspective, that's the closest. I think just given the incredibly messy politics in the country, it also makes it the most difficult, which is kind of a paradox between the two.
So if we continue a bit with personal perspective, as someone who is basically he's a Jew who lived few years and on few occasions in Arab countries, probably makes sense that most people that you met didn't knew you are a Jew. Um, Give us your take. How does it feel like? I mean, what do they really think about us? How was your experience with the way that they perceive Israel or the Jews, if it's the same thing or not at all? What
Yeah, look, I would say
reactions
you
with
again have to separate it, right? I mean, the Gulf is incredibly buttoned up. So ultimately, both culturally and just given the fact that, you have a ruling family that wants to portray itself as being incredibly tolerant, which they are. I mean, if you go to Dubai, if you go to Abu Dhabi, you have people from all over the world, right? There's 10 million people in the UAE, only a million of them are locals. So by definition, the majority of people are going to be of other nationalities or religions or creeds, etc. So, there's a thriving Jewish community in Abu Dhabi. There's an even bigger Jewish community in Dubai. I think when you speak with locals, they're incredibly polite. They're incredibly, I don't want to say open-minded, but they're incredibly accepting because they've been taught their entire lives that tolerance is kind of the backbone of this country, meaning the UAE. But
specifically
on the other hand,
UAE or you speak about the entire Gulf because there's a difference.
look, I mean, I think, look, I haven't spent as much time in Saudi, so I can speak specifically to the UAE as it relates to that. Within Saudi, you also have a much bigger population, right? There's 27 million Saudis. And so in Saudi, for example, there's 27 million Saudis, there's like 7 million expats. And so they're, three-quarters or two-thirds of the population. And in Saudi, you also have people who are like local Saudi taxi drivers, local Saudi, people working in restaurants, etc. In the UAE, you pretty much don't have that, right? You just have 1 million expats. I'm sorry, 1 million locals and 9 million expats. So the relationship with foreigners is slightly different because their country has always essentially been a country of foreigners. In Saudi, they don't have the interaction with as many people because one, it's always been closed, and two, it's just a bigger society. So this is a little bit more specifically towards the UAE. I think within Saudi, though, my experience has always been, again, like they're also very transactional, kind of how I was talking about President Trump. I mean, to the extent that something can benefit the Saudis and something can benefit the economy, all of their plans and all of their ambitions, they're pretty much willing to work with anyone. Now, obviously, having 27 million locals, you have a much larger domestic population, which, MBS has to account for, which is, probably why he's a little bit more hardline when it comes to kind of the Gaza situation. In the UAE, there hasn't really been much of an outcry either way. So I would say everything still stems from this kind of internal domestic politics where you have a ruling family who wants to make sure it appeases both its local population, but then also is able to continue to expand itself in whichever way is the most powerful. So, I never lived in Saudi, but having lived in the UAE, I can tell you that for me personally as a Jew, there was never any problems. I was affiliated with, and not affiliated, but friendly with there was a Chabad community in Abu Dhabi. Unfortunately, after I left, one of the rabbis was kidnapped. Someone who I had known, been to his house for Shabbat,
Rabbi
but
Logan.
my sense was that was a Iranian thing. I don't think that was the UAE, and I think the UAE kind of knows that they messed up. And I think that ultimately they got the guys very quickly and they executed them. So, like, again, these things could happen walking down the street in New York City. It's not to say that it's an excuse, but it's just to say that in the UAE, for example, I never felt unsafe. I never felt any kind of anti-Semitism. I never felt any kind of issues with it. And they opened up this, many of you may know, Abrahamic family house in Abu Dhabi, which is kind of three buildings, all of them the exact same size in architecture. One is a functioning synagogue, one is a functioning mosque, and one is a functioning church. And it's to show that we kind of all come from this, descendants of Abraham. So, I think that realistically living there was fine. In Lebanon, I would say amongst the Christian community, it's fine. There you do have a little bit more of a hardline Shia and Sunni population, and it's also a lot more I don't want to say segregated because that makes it sound like it's an official thing, but you generally have villages that are a lot more divided, right? You have a Christian village, you have a Sunni Shia village, and so from that perspective, I mean, look, it's a little bit trickier because in many ways, Lebanon is a collection of many different countries all living within one shared border. And a lot of people don't identify themselves as Lebanese first. I think the nice thing about the UAE is, people are Emiratis. And so it creates a little bit more of a social cohesion.
So the next question is a bit like a Miss Universe question, but
Okay.
how would you explain or describe the role of business in achieving peace?
Look, I would say it's somewhat circular, right? I mean, ultimately, everyone wants to have a better way to live and a better opportunity for themselves writ large. But I think that again, you have to bifurcate the Gulf from the Levant. In the Gulf, it's I think a lot more cut and dry, which is why the Abraham Accords started with a place like the UAE, and why I think Saudi could ultimately happen somewhat soon. Because at the end of the day, you have one kind of ruling family who sees that there's a benefit to doing business within country, and they have the ability to essentially tell their population, look, like this is what we've decided to do, and even if you're not okay with it, this is what we're doing, and it's for the best of the country. And within the UAE, for example, there's huge amounts of support for the royal family. They really think highly of the royal family. They think the royal family, both in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai, obviously two separate royal families. But they all think that they've done an incredibly good job of stewarding the country. So they're willing to defer to them if they say, okay, we want to have peace and do deals with Israel. We can have peace and do deals with Israel. I think in Lebanon, you really have multiple groups of people, and all of them have a different goal. And I think, unfortunately, some of them, their goal isn't necessarily to enrich themselves or to live in more prosperous. You have certain groups of people whose sole goal is the destruction of Israel. And so I think from that perspective, it's not that business won't help you get towards peace, but I just think that it's which one comes first. So in the case of a place like Lebanon, you probably have to have some level of tenuous relationship before you can start doing more deals. I think in the Gulf, that's exactly what we saw happen, right? I mean, the Abraham Accords came about because, the Gulf countries saw that there was an economic and kind of business benefit to doing a deal with Israel. So again, I would separate those two, and really they are like two completely different worlds. When you're in them, when you're living there, yeah, they happen to speak the same language. Although ironically, like Lebanese Arabic is very different from Gulf Arabic. And so, I think that ultimately, lumping them together is challenging because they're really driven by different pieces. They have different dynamics internally, and they also have different goals that they're trying to achieve.
You know that I think it was 20 years ago when we spoke about the new Middle East, the vision of Shimon Peres that was very much focused on innovation, startups, creating a prosperous economy, etc. I think that today this vision might sound old. We are in the AI era. Everything that was considered innovation 20 years ago is now old news. But how, first of all, in the context of what's going on specifically in Saudi Arabia, I know that it's not your main expertise, but the plans to create innovative cities, the plans to create, I would say, new infrastructures in Saudi Arabia. First of all, how do you make the connections between those plans and the future of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia? Because some people say that those are interlinked totally, and the plans cannot even be manifested without normalization with Israel. And how do you see the next vision, practical vision, like in terms of the Trump second term? How do you see the vision of businessmen, Israelis, American, and also from the West and from the Gulf countries, interacting in this new setting that is created after the October 7th to create something new.
Yeah, okay. So let me touch on Saudi a bit. And again, I want to be careful. So I think Saudi is the way to look at Saudi is that they're in many ways taking a huge gamble. Okay, so if you just look at the economy of Saudi Arabia and the amount of fiscal spending, uh, their break even on a barrel of oil, so essentially how much money they're pumping into the economy from various government benefits and things that they give to the economy, is about $90. When you add all of the additional investment, and now again, investment hopefully will pay off and have value, residual value, but let's just say for the time being that it just, doesn't go anywhere, right? Whether that's the soccer players, whether that's the golf leagues, whether that's these futuristic cities, that gets you closer to 110, $115 a barrel of oil. Oil right now, just looking at my screen, is about $66 a barrel. So they're running massive deficits. And why are they doing that? They're doing that for a couple of reasons. One is because, as I mentioned, at the end of the day, uh, MBS, recognizes that he has a massive country with a large number of people who, in a more modern world, are wondering to themselves, okay, why aren't we living in a place like Dubai or Abu Dhabi, and why hasn't this progressed in a way? And you also have a lot more uh, factions, within the country, just given its size. So I think the gamble that they're taking is, we hope that this will all pay off with an ability to then allow for the social cohesion to continue on, right? Part of the reason why Sheikh Maktoum in Dubai is so loved by everyone is because 20, 30 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer, he had this vision for what is now Dubai, and he kind of went for it and it came to fruition. And so now if you spoke with any local person who's actually from Dubai and Emirati, they have, incredible respect and admiration for him. I think MBS is trying to do the same thing. I think the risk to Israel in terms of the normalization of the relationship there is if it doesn't work out. And so, I mean, look, like if you go back into the 70s, and again, I'm not a historian, so I'm trying to pick my words carefully since I know this is recorded. But in 1979, there were two main things that everyone knows about, right? The overthrow of the Shah in Iran and Russia's invasion of Afghanistan. But the third one, which fewer people talk about, was actually someone from the eastern part of Saudi Arabia took over the mosque at Mecca, and they were forced to actually call in French commandos. And I can go separately into what the longer term ramifications of this were. But part of the reason that people believe that happened was because the 70s were a similar time to today in Saudi Arabia, where the country was kind of liberalizing, it was opening up. Uh, the royal family was seen spending a lot of money internationally. And what wound up happening was you had a big break between, the very conservative parts of the country and the royal family. And so I think that ultimately, if you were to see something like that happen again, let's say 5 years from now, none of these cities or the cities come to fruition in a much smaller size. And unfortunately, you're starting to see that, right? Neom has already been scaled down. The ski resort I was just reading about, Trahenia, is having a bunch of issues. I think were that to happen, the chances of Saudi becoming a little bit more insulated in the next 10 or 15 years are slightly higher. Um, how does that evolve for business people? The way I would look personally at Saudi is as a place where they're heavily demand for services, but I wouldn't want to be an asset owner within Saudi. So as consultants, as economic advisors, as construction companies, the types of people who are working on the ground, I think there's a huge opportunity there. If you look at someone like Hariri, who is the leader of Lebanon, he made all of his money essentially being a construction guy in Saudi Arabia. So I think there's still going to be domestic demand to try to build up that economy. Personally, I would say I'm less optimistic about potentially being an asset owner. I wouldn't want to own significant assets within Saudi if I had the choice between Saudi and say the UAE or something like that. I think how that impacts normalization is one of two ways, right? So with Israel, I think if things go very well, then that obviously opens up more of a ability for MBS to normalize with Israel. Although I think the results will be much further in the future than any potential normalization. I think normalization could occur in the next couple of years. I think the results of this, it's Vision 2030, and ultimately it'll probably get delayed beyond that. I think if things don't go well and there is some sort of domestic strife or unrest, given the large number of people in that country and given how, just massively big the size is, I think that creates a huge headwind against potential progress in the Middle East. So I would say I'm optimistic, but cautiously so.
Okay, Eric, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Gregory, for all of your insight and for joining us. I have a question that I want to pull back a little more to the India side, which is, I'm an American Israeli, if you can't tell by my accent. Recognize that it was, I think, maybe about 2.5 years ago, Modi was here. And I heard what you said about oil in Russia. But when I think about the fact that they're in BRICS, which, other than the UAE, consists of pretty much every enemy of the United States and Israel, how are we supposed to not be, at a minimum, hesitant, and some ways concerned about the influence on India from some of the people that hate both of our countries as much as they possibly could?
Yeah, understood. It's a good question. I mean, look, so a couple of things. I mean, I'm also somewhat skeptical of BRICS, just personally. I mean, if you look at BRICS, China is something like 80% of the GDP in terms of capital flows. I think realistically, where BRICS has the potential to create an impact on the broader economic system isn't through the actual allocation of assets or the potential trade. I think it's just through the transmission of capital. So what we saw after Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the U.S. weaponized the financial system. And again, we can go into a whole long argument about whether that was good or whether that was bad. But I think a lot of these countries woke up and said, like, okay, do we really want to have the SWIFT system as the only way that we can potentially be moving money around the world? And is there an alternative to that? And so that's why you're seeing a lot of adoption of things like Bitcoin. You're seeing, people try to do transactions in yuan. I think Saudi did an oil sale to China in yuan or renminbi. But if you then look at where they're ultimately allocating the capital, it's still coming back mostly into US dollar denominated assets because that's kind of where there's a huge amount of supply. So, I think as it relates to something like BRICS, so the first piece would be from the economic perspective, like, okay, maybe they find a way to transfer money in a different fashion between India and China, or India, Saudi, etc. But ultimately, it's like if I pay you in Bitcoin, if you don't want to hold the Bitcoin, you still have to then buy something in US dollars. I think then getting to the political influence, it's yet to be seen. I mean, I think it's a huge concern, and I think that's part of the reason why previous administrations were a lot tougher in thinking about this potential on BRICS. Because again, getting back to what I said about Trump, there isn't this moral imperative or initiative, right? You're right. Brazil, Russia, India, China, Saudi, those countries don't really like India, don't really like Israel or the U.S. But I think Trump sees it as, okay, if I can make a deal with them, I'll make a deal with them, whether or not that's good morally or not. I do think, having spent quite a bit of time in in India, I do think that what holds those guys together could ultimately also tear them apart, which is that there is no moral underpinning, right? There isn't really like a natural relationship, especially if you look at Russia, India, and China, right? Like technically, if you just look on a map, you would think that the three of them would kind of be enemies. And at different points in time, they have been enemies, they have been allies, they've had skirmishes, etc. So in many ways, it's a marriage of convenience, and it's a marriage of, and Modi, look, I mean, it was democracy, but he is taking on an increasingly kind of authoritarian type leadership. So if you look at kind of three strongman leaders amongst them, they're looking out for what they think is best. I think insofar as that they ever have to make a sacrifice for the greater BRICS nations, I don't see that being something that they're willing to do. So I personally don't see it as much of an ideological risk in the way that, okay, they're working with people that hate the US, because I don't think they're necessarily doing it to further the cause of hating the US or hating Israel. I think they're just doing it for what they can get out of it in that moment, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. If anyone else wants to ask something, it's a good timing. Meanwhile, Gregory, I would like to ask you. It's usually I ask the same question most of my guests. I know it's a tricky one, but it's also an interesting one. So presumably, if you were the Prime Minister of Israel today, what would you do?
No, look, I mean, I can't speak as much to the internal politics, just having not spent as much time there. But speaking about it from a purely kind of like economic and geopolitical strategy perspective, the first thing I would do is try to diversify my relationships insofar as that, even if that means being able to buy arms and weaponry from other countries. Because I think at this point, having such a heavy reliance on the US has significantly hindered the ability for the country to do. Again, we can all debate what is best and what is right or wrong, but that should be a decision that is made within Israel. It shouldn't be influenced by the US. It shouldn't be influenced by anyone else. And if you've seen, I mean, both Biden and Trump have had the ability to put a lot of pressure on, things like war planning, things like defense, etc. So I don't know how to think about doing that in the intermediate term. But if you ask me one goal that I would try to have if I was the prime minister of Israel, it would be to try to diversify the kind of quote unquote supply chain of the country so that if there ever was another situation, no individual country could exert outside influence. And as much as this might sound like anathema, especially given, that last question, I personally would not limit myself to ideological bedfellows, right? At the end of the day, yes, the US and Israel, in theory, share the same ideology, but that doesn't really mean anything if you're not there for your friend in a time of need. And so if it's something like, okay, we can get weapons from even China or somewhere else, I would seriously consider that because I think that right now there's just too much risk to the country to being able to effectuate its own strategy that it wants to effectuate.
So I want to ask you a question about the Emirates. And I know that you can't speak on behalf of the Emirates, but I'm looking for assessment. Because, well, first of all, I have to point out that what we're seeing is that the Abraham Accord basically survived the Gaza war, which is not at all. I wouldn't predict that in certainty, but it happened so far. But from now on, first of all, I think it's becoming obvious, or at least, reality changes all the time. But the chances are that the IDF is going to completely conquer Gaza. And afterwards, there's a good question of what's going to happen there, because one alternative is that somehow, maybe in joint forces, maybe together with the UAE, maybe together with other elements, there will be some process that will grow Palestinian Gazan leadership who will become the de facto the leadership of Gaza, not in the same way that Hamas was running the show, but Palestinian leadership that has some sort of autonomy of self-governance. And the other scenario is that Israel will basically occupy and colonize Gaza. Now, my understanding is that the other scenario is harsh for the Emirates. First of all, what do you think about this entire concept? And second of all, what do you think that could happen on both scenarios? I mean, first,
Yeah,
if
look, I obviously don't speak for anyone other than myself, but I will say the following. I, I think that you have to be very careful to separate the people making the decision, what they want, and then what they want to kind of give to their domestic population. So, for example, I would say, let's just do a complete thought experiment, hypothetical. Okay. Let's say that there was a resolution to the war in Gaza, which included, I don't know, Israel completely occupying Gaza, colonizing it, and some sort of a forced resettlement of the Palestinians around the world, right? Some in Europe, some in this and that. I think that the United Arab Emirates and the Saudi leadership would come out strongly against that, because I think domestically that's what their population wants to hear. I think internally they would be heavily in favor of that. I think they have a huge amount of problems with Iranian influence, with Muslim Brotherhood. You look at what happened in Bahrain, you obviously see what happened in the Arab Spring. At the end of the day, the Gulf leaders want to be prosperous, and they recognize that Israel is a better path to prosperity than. I mean, look, there are no Palestinians that have been taken into the Gulf, right? So it's kind of one of those things where they understand that there's a potential problem, but they're trying to balance the domestic audience versus kind of what they think makes the most sense. And I think it's a fine line, but I think actually the way they're doing it works very well because, to your point, the Abrahamic Accords have survived, but they haven't really done anything either way, right? Like, I think what the Abrahamic Accords gave the UAE is kind of the ultimate optionality, right? If things continue to work out well with Israel, they were the first to sign it, they have this relationship. If things ever go poorly with Israel, they can say, okay, we tried, we scrapped the agreement, and at the end of the day, we're going to do what's best for our people. So I think that in the event that Israel kind of takes a firmer approach into Gaza, and again, I'm not saying what I think they should or they shouldn't do. I actually think initially there might be some hand-wringing, but somewhat counterintuitively, I think it actually increases the chances of additional normalization and further cooperation in business partnerships. Because I think once it happens, if it happens, then yes, there will be some upset people outwardly, but I think the idea of having a peaceful ability for them to go in and whether they have some sort of, as you mentioned, some sort of role in the rebuilding of it, or whether, the Emirates creates almost like another emirate in the region, that I don't know enough about. But I think that would kind of be something that the leadership would look favorably upon. And I tried to say that very carefully. So I'm not sure if I said anything at all, but that was kind of the way I was thinking about it.
Okay, great. Shahar, you want to ask something?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Gregory.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, wonderful. So I have a lot of financial related questions, but the most interesting ones are, naturally political. And we've been talking, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, and you don't have to answer. But it looks like it's pretty obvious that the good, or let's say the mellow forces in the Middle East have been sitting on the fence. Everybody's trying to see how Gaza is going to get resolved, and pushing everything to that point. Why, in your opinion? Because leaders are leaders, and they're expected to lead, and they're expected to voice their opinion, and there should be opinion. I mean, if we're going the Abrahamic way, there should be a very clear voice from the partner part of the Middle East on how this should be resolved. They should be more involved. And my question is, why do you think they're not just up and saying, okay, this is we really want to progress with the Abrahamic Accords. It's a shame about Gaza, but this is what you need to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's set up working groups. Let me come visit you. Let me address the Israeli people. I mean, why are they not being proactive on this and just waiting?
Yeah, okay. So I'll give you kind of my answer for the fact that we're being recorded, and then maybe offline I can give you more detail. But I would say, look, like ultimately at the end of the day, I don't think that that's the perspective that the leaders have in terms of like, we have to quote unquote be leaders in the moral sense. I think that they see themselves as leaders and shepherds and you know, steering their people into whatever is best for them and their people. And if you look at a family like the Nayan family, I mean, ultimately in the UAE, there's like 50 tribes, and there's probably 6 or 7 which are incredibly powerful. Obviously, not as powerful as the Nayan family, but you know, depending on who you talk to, estimates are that the Nayan family has ruled for roughly 300 years. So how do you kind of, you know, create some level of cohesion amongst all of these various factions, which sometimes are at war with each other, sometimes at war internally, right? Brothers against brothers, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the way that they've done that and the way that they do that is by kind of never overcommitting, taking a very, very longer view, seeing how things play out so that ultimately, whatever the instance is, things can work out. And I think what you see when you're there is very much this, like, I think it's a very American or Israeli mindset to just say, like, let's go for it. Like, I hope it works out. And if it doesn't work out, we'll figure something else out. And I think, again, getting back to the previous question about Lebanon, I think Lebanese people have a similar mindset. I think the Gulf is the exact opposite. It's like, let's see how it plays out. And then once we have some clarity, then we go for it, right? Because I think the people ultimately, especially within the UAE and also in Saudi, really, I mean, the people have such, first of all, even if they didn't love the leadership, there isn't a ton that they can do. But they truly do love the leadership, right? Like if you speak with a local Emirati, they all have pictures of the sheikh in their house. They think very highly of what they've done. And there is some, you know, credence to that, right? I mean, 15, 20 years
They
ago,
have a
Abu Dhabi was
comfortable
sand.
life.
Right, exactly. I mean, 40 years ago, Dubai was sand, and now these are like, you know, incredibly modern places. So I think the point is, when we look at it from the quote unquote Western moral perspective, we sit there and we wonder, okay, why aren't people speaking out? Why aren't people coming out more strongly and making a view? But I think when you look at it from, and this was for me incredibly hard working there, right? And I think I told you guys this, but for reference, you know, when I was there, I was working on an almost purely local team. So, you know, most people go to Dubai and they never see a local because it's like any other major cosmopolitan city. In Abu Dhabi, you know, 70% of people were either wearing the white kandoras or the black, the women abayas. So I was, you know, quite, you know, heavily involved in meeting and understanding and getting to know the local population. And so I think ultimately, when you look at it from that perspective, the way they see it is there's no real benefit to coming out and saying anything. I mean, ultimately, they want to, and this is why my argument for the UAE, and I don't mean this in a negative way, has always been, you know, I don't think they want to become New York. I think they want to become Switzerland, right? They want to become a place which has a lot of people with a lot of money, high quality place of life. Everyone is welcome. You know, you've got everything from, you know, moral people to warlords to, you know, people from Iran, people from Africa, people from the US, all working in one place. And to the extent that they're able to cooperate on the ground, they're welcome there. And I just don't think that it benefits the royal family to really rock the boat at all. And in many ways, it's the ultimate transaction because whether something is right or wrong doesn't really matter in the moral sense. And you could make an argument that ultimately, like, it's all in the perspective of who's making the decision anyway. Like, obviously, we all have our biases, etc. So I've gotten to understand that mindset a little bit more having lived there. And I think it's always going to be very challenging for them to come out and kind of take the lead on any geopolitical kind of quote unquote moral type issue.
Great. Shahar, anything else?
Wonderful. No, thanks. That was the unfortunately that was a very good answer. But you know, it is how it is. We try to get them to act out. We know what's being said in, you know, in closed doors, but it's as you say, they're
It's like I said, I
frustratingly
mean, look,
neutral.
like I think that ultimately, and this is why I have to be careful when I say that I think Israel got the least out of the Abraham Accords, not because it was a negative, but because just the nature of the way that the countries do business, Israel has to be willing to give up a bigger step in order to get a smaller incremental step. And it's never going to be even. And so in many ways, it's almost like, it's not an irrelevant question, but it's more like, as long as Israel is getting a benefit of it, even if it means that the other side is getting a lot more benefit of it, it's still better for Israel, is the kind of way of thinking about it.
True. Thanks, Gregory.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thanks, Gregory. So before we wrap it up, do you think that there's something that we should hear or know from you that you haven't covered in this lecture? Or do you want to add something about maybe instructions or tips for Israelis who would like to facilitate or to become a part of the normalization process with our world? What would you recommend?
Look, I would say that the recommendations from me, and again, as always, my perspective, is unfortunately getting back to the last question, you kind of have to meet them where they are. And I did meet a lot of Israelis. I think I told you guys the story, uh, some guy came and he had this agriculture technology. And as I mentioned, the UAE has a massive food security problem. They import 97% of the food. And he said, "Oh, you're at Mubadala." And he met me and he gave me this whole pitch. He said, "Give me 1 acre of land anywhere in the desert. It can be completely in the middle of nowhere, and I will be able to grow something on it." He said, I can't tell you exactly what it'll be because it depends on, the soil and the this and that, but I'll prove that I can grow something." And after 2 years, he couldn't even get someone to give him one, unused acre of land. And I think it's just because the way that decision making gets done, the way business gets done, it's all through that lens of maintaining stability. Again, they don't want to have, even if that growth rate is up, if there's a lot of variability, they would rather have a slower growth rate but more steady. And so I think to the extent that people want to work with the Gulf, I do think it's a very nice place to go. The people are tolerant, the people are open-minded. I think that it has to be a longer term commitment. I don't think it's like the typical startup idea where, okay, you've got a great idea, you go out, you raise a bunch of money and you do it. It's years of building the relationships and meeting people. And the problem with it is that unfortunately a lot of people are doing it, right? Especially after COVID. You have everyone from Europe, you've got all these other people, because at one point everyone thought, oh, these guys have tons of money, we're going to go out there and be the next ones to raise a bunch of money. So, I think about it from that perspective. Uh, I think depending on how you want to get involved, what types of businesses, what types of partnerships, maybe the Gulf is the best place, maybe it's not. There's obviously other places in the kind of broader Arab world, but I think really a lot of it is kind of cultural and driven by how the people interact.
Thank you. Eric?
Yeah, no, I was going to ask Gregory a question, but I think it's now more about a statement, kind of reaffirming what he said, which I think is part of the problem, is that Israelis walk into a boardroom and expect within an hour they're going to walk out with a deal.
Yeah.
And I was nowhere near as much time as Gregory, but I have spent quite a bit of time getting to know, and I would Emiratis would put their arm around me and try to explain to me, Eric, look, you have to come to my house for dinner 5 times. You have to meet my father. You have to meet my family. And just to share an anecdote, I went to the very first NBA game in Abu Dhabi and was sitting with a very senior official. And one of the members of the royal family actually came over. And my Emirati friend said to me, Eric, do you have a business card? I said, no, you told me not to do business cards, not to, be business. He said, Eric, you're now past the test. You need to carry business cards with you. But to Gregory's point, culturally, I think especially with Israelis, they don't get the commitment, the building of trust and everything else. And then we try to rush into things and we get frustrated and we turn it into a negative, is trying to understand that the culture is such a big part of it. And that if we would be more patient and work harder and not worry as much about business, that we would be more successful. I think we're giving up in a way too soon.
Yeah, look, I would add two things. I would say one is just remember, in a weird way, and part of the reason why I use the Switzerland example rather than the New York example is, for the most part, they don't have to do anything, right? The status quo is a pretty great option for them. It's in a place like New York or Tel Aviv, you kind of have a perpetual motion machine where if you stop innovating, you stop growing, then everything falls apart. They don't have that. So if they were to do nothing, they still have $2 or $3 trillion of sovereign reserves. They have this economy that's already been built up. So there's not as much of an impetus to do it. The only thing I would add, though, is just as a piece of advice, and it's very hard to really know the answers. Emiratis and Saudis are incredibly polite people, and it's very bad to say no to someone's face. And so I know for a fact many times where people were trying to be persistent, trying to be very patient. They would come to Mubadala over the course of years, have meetings every time they thought they had a great meeting. And unfortunately, we knew we were never going to do anything with them. But the idea of just giving someone a no is very, very frowned upon culturally. So what you do is you kind of ask them for more information, more come back to us, come back to us, come back to us. So it becomes a little bit challenging, and it has to be something I think where, to your point, Eric, it's a long-term relationship that you see that there's enough upside that you're willing to kind of continue on, continue on, continue on, because you're never really going to get negative feedback unless you really get to know someone very well. And I can tell you about a ton of meetings I've had with people, and I was coming with, from Mubadala in the government with locals, and they would say nothing but great things, and then a year later, nothing would happen. So, it's ultimately it's a double-edged sword because, in the States or in Tel Aviv, if someone doesn't like your idea, they'll say, okay, well, we're not interested. And you kind of say, okay, thank you, I'm going to go on to the next prospect. There you do see a lot of people who get kind of caught in this never-ending rabbit hole where they say, okay, one more meeting, one more meeting, one more meeting. So, it's something just to keep in mind if trying to do business there.
Very important. By the way, do you think it's the same in Lebanon?
No. I'm telling you, I think the people in Lebanon, personally, my experience has been, like I said, they're the most kind of compatible with Israelis. Look, like getting back to my question of, if I was prime minister, what would I do? I mean, anything you could do to normalize. I mean, I'm also obviously biased because my wife is Lebanese, so I'd love for her to be able to visit Israel, but and I would love to be able to, to whatever. But I think that anything that we could do to facilitate the normalization there, I continue to believe that that's the most natural fit. And I will say, like, if you go to the places where you have the mixing of Israelis and Lebanese, like places like Abu Dhabi and places like Dubai, they generally tend to get along very, very well. And so just culturally, the approach to business, the approach to liveliness, fun, etc., I think fits very, very well. It's a tough situation given everything that's happening politically there.
So basically, you suggest, regardless of the fact that the Lebanese economy is very different than the Saudi or the Emirati economy, but basically what you suggest is that the clique will be clickened with Israel in Lebanon, or this is the best shot to create, I would say, a vast cooperation, something that is really also have a borderline, coastline. There are issues with natural gas. There are issues of import-export. Basically, you're suggesting...
The only thing I would say is the Emirati and Saudi and the Gulf economies are very impressive at a top-line number, but, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but they're not like sophistically complicated economies, right? So, there's a lot of research out there that talks about, fragility and complexity, whether that's within an economy or within an ecosystem, etc. And, one of the things they're trying to address this is what Saudi is trying to do with its Vision 2030. Obviously, the UAE has been doing this for longer, is to try to increase the complexity of the economy, because a complex economy, by definition, is more able to handle resilient, stress. It's more resilient. So I think that in a weird way, Lebanon has had numerous economic issues, for years, and a war, and banking crisis, and a currency crisis, blah, 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 blah. But if you could somehow disaggregate all of that, it's actually a much more complex economy. It has tourism, it has production, it has, a financial services sector, albeit no longer. And so, I think the answer is that, one, it's a more natural click from a personality and a cultural perspective. But I do think, and again, like, unfortunately, I don't see this as anything that's going to happen anytime soon, just given the political situation there. And so ultimately, it makes more sense to focus the initiative on Saudi and on the UAE and on the places, frankly, I think even a chance of something happening with Syria is probably more likely than something that's happening with Lebanon. But, I think that were it ever to come to fruition, it would be a very natural fit. And maybe it's the last kind of domino to fall, and then, everything is great. But I do think if that ever does happen, it would feel very natural.
Thank you so much, Gregory. I think it was very important and enlightening. We learned a lot. If someone wants to add a quick last question, we will allow it. But if not, then again, thank you for your time. It was very interesting. I hope that our viewers will find value in it. And have a great evening. Is it evening where you at?
It's early afternoon here, but yeah, you guys have a great evening over there. And look, if anyone ever wants to reach out, feel free to share my contact information. I'm happy to discuss further. And like I said, I mean, some things, when we're offline, I can give more detail. I wanted to try to be a little bit careful about what I said, but happy to continue the conversation.
Definitely will do.
Perfect.
Thank you, Gregory.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Gregory.
Bye.